So for a laugh, I decided to watch the infamous Pureflix film God's Not Dead, since I knew a buddy of mine got it as a present a few years ago. I'd always heard that the film ends at a concert with a member of the Duck Dynasty family congratulating the main character Josh for proving to his philosophy class that God's not dead.
I'm happy to announce that the reports of God's death were greatly exaggerated.
Although for some reason I'd always assumed that the concert was actually the Duck Dynasty guy, but it turns out the concert is actually for a band called the Newsboys. My buddy warned my girlfriend Bloodsky and I that it was going to be an earworm. However, maybe it's because my buddy is religious and we're not, or that the song capped a 2-hour film that presented atheists as a bunch of detached, self-righteous elitists.
Well, I think this dinner serves as a valuable lesson. As Socrates put it over 2,000 years ago, noti seaton.
Looks like it's Greek to her.
Oh, it's a know thyself, darling, know thyself, which I suggest means knowing your own limitations.
But it did not really stick with us. If you're hoping to hear me tear apart the song God's Not Dead by the Newsboys, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this is the Dog Bowl. And dogs, we don't shit what we eat. However, it did make me think if I'd ever heard a Christian song that I do like. During the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I began diving into the larger catalog of a 1990s ska band called Pain. If you grew up with Cartoon Network or Boomerang as a kid, like I did, you'll probably recognize their animated music video, Jabberjaw Running Underwater. After listening to all their songs, I decided to take a quick look on Wikipedia to make sure there weren't any missing tracks on Apple Music. And I found out that they had reformed the previous year under a new name, Salvo, with a whole new album too, off the charts. It quickly became one of my favorite albums of the past few years, filled with songs I was happy to listen to over and over again throughout the first part of the pandemic. But from the very beginning, I knew that my favorite track on the album was the song Things Go Away. The song undoubtedly evokes Christian imagery and language, which quickly became obvious upon examining the lyrics more closely. Yet despite this, I still find the themes of loss and death to be highly relatable. While I may have a different view of the afterlife from the author, I think there's ultimately a lot more that we can agree on about death than there might seem at first glance. So let's dig into the Dog Bowl and find out how listening to Things Go Away by Salvo can help us fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts. Before I break down the song, I think it's worth addressing why I, an atheist, would consider it a Christian song. But first, let's talk about why it's not a Christian song. As someone who received a bachelor's degree in advertising and PR, I'm well aware that what makes a song Christian in the same way as God's Not Dead all comes down to marketing. The aforementioned Newsboys single is intended for a Christian demographic from a band already known to appeal to a religious audience. Meanwhile, Things Go Away is a song from a reformed 90s ska punk band that appears alongside tracks such as Why's It Gotta, a song about a dog chained, left bored waiting for his owner. Goblin Orchestra, a song about joining a goblin orchestra, and the song about rain, which is a song about rain. So if you think it's cheating to call Things Go Away a Christian song, well then I'm kind of inclined to agree. So then why do I, an atheist, believe that it's a Christian song aside from the blatant references to biblical ideas, such as heaven, which could just be a cross-cultural metaphor? Well, remember that Wikipedia article I mentioned earlier? Let me tell you a bit more I learned from that. According to the article, the reason they initially ended their time as Pain in 2000 was so that the founding member and lead singer Dan Lord could pursue his religious calling. According to Dan's own Wikipedia page, after dissolving Pain, he went on to receive a Master's of Theology and even published a Catholic theological work titled Choosing Joy for Our Sunday Visitor. Sure, I know Wikipedia can be a dubious source of facts at times, but this was nonetheless the information that colored my own reading of the song for quite some time. Finally, the nail on the head that I found while researching for this video is that on Salvo's website, where they provide the lyrics, they're credited to Dan Lord himself, as well as, in parentheses, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, and is the only song to receive such a credit. So while it may not be sold as a Christian song, there's more than sufficient reason to say the lyrics are heavily influenced by the author's own deeply held religious beliefs, and therefore it's appropriate to call it a Christian song. Keep in mind that this video is my own interpretation of the song and what it means to me, not necessarily the author. So while my own reading may not line up with the author's intended meaning, I certainly do try to take it into account. With that out of the way, let's look to the first set of lyrics.
From out of eggs came little birds. One of them fell down on our trampoline. With love and bread we tried but couldn't save her. We tried to understand what it could mean.
In these opening lines, Lord uses the life cycle of birds to evoke three great mysteries: birth, life, and death. Birds have had a long history of representing death and fertility that continues to this day, as anyone who is told about the birds and the bees can tell you.
Could you tell us about the birds and the bees?
I don't think I'm really the right person to
But it says in the manual that the scout leader is supposed to tell us about that kind of stuff.
Really?
There is a certain childlike naivete to the first verse. From out of eggs came little birds, reminding us of a time when we too were just beginning to learn about how babies were made. In the two preceding lines, we quickly shift from the miracle of birth to tragedy, as we imagine the chick falling to meet mortal injuries and a failed attempt to save her. Finally, the line, "We tried to understand what it could mean," evokes both individualistic and collective symbolism on the contemplation of death and its meaning. The individualistic symbolism is our own experience as children, learning that we are mortal too and will one day die. This kind of understanding usually comes about when we lose a family member, friend, or pet and must confront the reality that they're not coming back. I had my first encounter with death when I was just 4 years old. Though I can't recall much else from the time, I still vividly remember my mother picking up our old wired telephone as I was watching the TV. My attention was immediately drawn to her as she began to cry. So I ran over and she had told me that my grandfather had passed away. I recalled that I could understand the concept of death from stories such as The Phantom Menace, where both hero and villain die by the end. Which, by the way, in 1999, Maul was dead, so don't try to get smart with me in the comments, okay? Anyways, my last memory of my grandfather before that call was my mother dropping him off at the airport. There was no indication that this would be the last time we saw him. Though, to me, it felt as if though he'd literally exited my life, as if though he were a character in my story. I can't quite explain why, but at the time it was kind of easy for me to accept that he wasn't coming back. Though my contemplation of death is a lifelong process that still continues. The collective symbolism refers to those early pioneers of thought and spirituality that began to wonder, why we die, and what it means. Though it may be difficult, we must imagine a time before understanding, before we told ourselves stories, and think of what it was like to grasp the fact of mortality without a history. Whether or not we've truly attained a better understanding of death since those early ancestors is a matter of debate. I don't think it's unfair to say that we're still squabbling trying to understand what it could mean. It's beautiful how, in so few words, Lord is able to establish the themes of the song, while telling a tragic little story about a poor little bird.
Don't you remember we told you? Mr. Hooper died. He's dead.
Oh, yeah, I remember. Well, I'll give it to him when he comes back.
Next, we're introduced to the refrain of the song.
Things go away, things go away. They will laugh someday in heaven when the tears wipe away. They will return, they will return. They will laugh at just how difficult this always was.
The context of this refrain can be said to change slightly depending on its placement, while also maintaining the consistent overall meaning of the song. So for now, I'll focus on its relationship to the previous verses and tackle the greater meaning towards the end. In relation to our poor departed little bird and the mysteries she presents us with, this refrain provides us with the only conclusion we can agree on. Inquisitive young children presented with death may have a myriad of questions about death and what happens afterwards, which an adult might not be able to answer. While we may not understand what it could mean, we can end the conversation by agreeing that the bird is gone and dead, as shall we one day. While it might not be the most satisfying answer, it's the only one based in fact. What's so great about these lines is that Lord is once again able to tell a quick story to evoke strong imagery and emotions in the listener.
A boy rides in his daddy's arms that swing like hammers and carry rocks. One day those arms fall softly down beside him, and they're folded up into a wooden box.
These lyrics of losing a father manages to relate to the first story while conveying a very different kind of relationship with death and loss. The opening lines are about a life tragically taken too early from the author. This is now contrasted by an experience of a much longer and deeper connection with a family member. The father in these lyrics teaches us that there is more to mortality than the mere dichotomy of life and death. Aging and everything that comes with it is very much a part of that experience. In the Bible, God brings Adam to life as a fully formed man, ageless and immortal, though it could be said that at this stage Adam is still very childlike in his own way. In the garden, he and his wife are provided for until they eat from the fruit of knowledge and are kicked out of Eden into a world where they must work to survive while facing the ravages of disease and aging. Though I think he's just an allegory and not a historical figure, let's consider the perspective of Adam as the first man who will die. He would have been surprised to find his body getting weaker, his skin starting to wrinkle, and perhaps even his mind beginning to deteriorate. We, however, have examples all around us of what it is to age. Through the father figure, we witness the passage of time, but this is no mere exercise in empathy, since we're all going to experience getting old. What goes away here isn't just a father, but the youth he loses along the way. In just 4 lines, we see a father go from a middle-aged man to a senior and then to rest. But it's important to remember that while something may be lost, something else is also gained, potentially. A father may become a grandfather, a wiser man, and so much more. In this context, the refrain goes beyond the boundaries of death and asks us to consider, what else have we already lost that will never come back? Once you've accepted that your youth is gone, it becomes easier to accept and expect that you only have more to lose. But it's okay, because we all go through it. Returning to my earlier story, seeing my mom lose her father made me realize that one day I'd have to experience losing a parent too. And just like in the lyrics, I've heard her reminisce about the man my grandfather was, describing a version of him that had long been gone even by the time that I was born. This verse also makes me reflect on my own dad, and how my little sister, 16 years my younger, is growing up with a more mature and refined version of the man who raised me. Yes, the young man that I knew as my father has gone away, and one day, the dad I see raising my little sister will also be gone, replaced by an even older man that may be asking me for help.
We're on our way, but the dragon is by the road, watching us pass. Voracious, we go to the Father's home, but the dragon is here by the road.
This verse begins with a triumphant declaration that asks us to accept our mortality by stating a fact, that yes, we are all indeed on our way. Of course, Lord being a Christian, it can easily be assumed that he means we're on our way to heaven. If you're familiar with Christian symbolism, then you may have already assumed that the dragon can be read as an allegory for evil. I realize that the dragon can also be a representation of the devil as a character, but I'm going to stick with the broad category of evil for simplicity's sake. What's fascinating is that the dragon is not a temptation as evil is so often portrayed, but rather as a predator towards the end of the journey, described as eyeing us hungrily. Yet the song goes on to mention that we go to the Father of Souls without mention of judgment, which is why I hesitate to call the dragon a representation of hell or Satan. Instead, I offer two possibilities for the dragon's meaning. The first is that the dragon is a metaphor for the sins we reflect on as we're dying. There are, of course, countless deathbed confessions which suggest that humans have a natural tendency to clear our conscience when we think we're at death's door. Lord is specifically of the Catholic denomination, which places a heavy emphasis on the need for confession. Regardless of whether or not someone confesses anything on their deathbed, they do have to live and die with whatever guilt they keep to themselves. Their own dragon by the side of the road, if you will. The second possibility is that the dragon isn't sin or evil at all, but rather a fear of death itself. Stoic philosophy mentions that death is naturally imbued with fear so that we don't rush into it foolishly. The road to death is one we all travel, however the dragon gives us reason to approach with caution, but inevitably, we'll all pass him by along our journey. By evoking God specifically as a father, Lord continues the paternal themes from the previous verse. God in this context also seems to be a destination at the end of the road. What I appreciate about this song as someone that doesn't really share in the author's faith is that it never pushes us to achieve an afterlife with God.
I can't believe I'm stuck in an elevator with God. Although I guess you are everywhere and in all places.
Whether it's the intention of the author or not, it gives it a more universalist quality that makes it more inviting and relatable for non-believers like myself.
Things go away, and we'll have some day in heaven when the tears get wiped away. They will return, and we'll laugh at just how difficult it's always was to learn.
Now let's examine the greater meaning of the refrain. The words things brings to mind again the Stoic philosophy, this time on the subject of externals. Externals refer to things outside of you, which you have no control over. Even your body, being subject to the uncertain ravages of aging and disease, is considered by the Stoics to be an external. It's easy to picture ourselves giving up merely material things, though so much harder in practice. However, the things we're told will go away are a baby bird, our father, and ourselves. It might not be too hard to find some psycho that thinks a baby bird is just a material object, but you'd be hard-pressed to find very many people willing to say the same about their dad and themselves. All three subjects certainly warrant being cared for and acknowledged as important while they're alive, but I think the Lord is asking us to detach ourselves from them once they've died, transition from living beings into a thing. Of course, detaching ourselves from anything, especially the dead, is always easier said than done. The following lines refer to the afterlife, where the grieving will come to an end. Although I do believe that Lord is being as literal as he can be when he refers to heaven in poetry, I still can't help but to take it figuratively. One of the more fascinating aspects about Christianity to me as an outsider is the multitude of ways in which the mythology has been interpreted, from absolute history to insightful poems, yet it's understood what concepts are being referred to. For example, Adam and Eve are the literal first humans to some Christian sects, while others consider them as allegories to the first true humans. So I don't feel that it's unfair of me to have an interpretation of heaven that isn't referring to a literal afterlife as the author does, because we can agree that what we're talking about is heaven. My own vision of the afterlife, as it relates to these lyrics at least, is that there is none.
Schmuck! There's no Jewish heaven. Our faith teaches us that once you're dead, that's it, kaput, it's dark, it's cold. It's like that apartment we lived in before I started doing weddings.
Stoicism, if you haven't figured out yet, has heavily influenced my views on death, and points out how ridiculous our fear of death is by asking us to consider why it's so bad. There are several exercises which continuously lead us to the same conclusion that death is a peaceful sleep-like state that leaves us no worse off than before we were born. I realize that this is an old cliche, but I think that heaven is a state of mind we're in as we die. We can choose to put ourselves in hell and occupy our minds with regret, or we can think of the good times and show people around us that we're going to be okay. From my point of view, the only people who truly suffer from death are those who have to grieve. And so we're bitterly reminded that they won't return. That's just the plain truth, and yet there are people who need to be reminded of this. Even when we accept that they've gone, we're still capable of holding on to the dearly departed, such as by grieving as if though they were still dying, holding on to unresolved grudges, or any other number of unhealthy coping mechanisms. I don't mean to belittle people who've struggled with loss, but somewhere along the healing process, they had to deal with making peace with change. This final line reminds us that conquering the fear of death is a lifelong process that requires accepting loss and change. By telling us to laugh, it lets us know that we shouldn't be ashamed of failing the lesson, not accepting things as they are. All we can do is try again. Death changes us more than it does the dead, because we're the ones who have to learn to live with a different tomorrow. And we have to learn to live with that kind of change time and time again. I mentioned earlier that Off the Charts is not a Christian-themed album, nor is Salvo a Christian band. However, Things Go Away does seem to contribute to a different overall theme shared throughout most of the tracks. The gap between Pain and Salvo lasted from 1999 to 2019. Since that time, returning members like Lord himself have grown from young to middle-aged, and the songs definitely reflect this change. I mean, you can't get any more on the nose than the first track titled Anthem for the Middle-Aged Man, where Lord triumphantly declares, "I have the power to reclaim what was lost." Very likely a reference to the musical career he put aside for his theology's master. The self-titled track, Off the Charts, is a song about how a humble life can exceed expectations of happiness with somebody to love, while Why's It Gotta Be is a song about a dog tied to a post waiting for his owner to return. It also feels as if though it speaks to the passage of time as only a man in his autumn years can speak to it. The song about rain is about slowing down and loving the day for what it is, and not just a song about rain, as I alluded to earlier. Even a goofy-sounding song, like Goblin Orchestra, is about the joy of creating music in a group. I'm not going to break down every song on the album, so I'll sum it up by saying that it encompasses the idea to love one's fate. Amor fati, as philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche put it. So many of the songs are a reminder to appreciate the tremendous values of the little things in life, like family, art, or even a rainy day. While Things Go Away is the 5th track on the album, thematically, it's the final embodiment of the album's Amor fati attitude, by asking us to love what will ultimately be our fate. The best way I can think to describe the overall feel of the album myself is that it has a kind of post-midlife crisis vibe to it. And by the way, in case it's not obvious just by listening to my voice, I'm actually only in my late 20s. So, no midlife crisis yet, but I figured it's better to learn from others before I get there. So why can I appreciate a Christian song like Things Go Away while being bored by songs like God's Not Dead? Well, I think it comes down to how I perceive sincerity in each song. I don't really know very much about the Newsboys outside of God's Not Dead, but I will say that while their song didn't come off to me as insincere, it didn't feel as sincere to me as Things Go Away. The music video, much like the film of the same name, makes science out to be a philosophical weapon against religion, with a radio reporting.
In a statement released today, scientists have announced that based on their research, they have concluded that God is a myth.
It's goofy and reeks of Christian propaganda, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't at least feel a little genuine. Still, I can't help but to feel that I'm receiving an apologetics argument in the form of a song. Perhaps somewhere the Newsboys might have said that they hoped their song would convert people, but it's clear to me that as religious art, God's Not Dead, especially now that it's tied into the Pureflix franchise, reinforces faith more than spreading it. Things Go Away, on the other hand, doesn't feel as if though it's necessarily trying to reinforce the artist's religious beliefs. In fact, it took me quite a few listens before catching the overt Christian references, and I didn't know the song was credited to St. Cyril until I started doing research for this video. The song doesn't come off as an abbreviated sermon, but rather more like Lord is simply sharing his own perspective on death. As stated previously, it's foolish for someone with my background to assume that there isn't a target audience for any product. But I can certainly acknowledge the power of art that feels simultaneously passionate and yet also apolitical. While I'm aware that my own views don't really line up with Lord's, I can still feel invited to enjoy the song and consider what he has to say and how it might positively affect my own outlook on life. I think part of what hit me about the song Things Go Away was just the timing of when I heard it. It was during the beginning of the pandemic lockdown in California. Death tolls were going up on the news, normality had changed drastically, and a relative of mine was in a losing battle with cancer. A song about accepting change and moving on with life was just what I needed to get me through those early days when everyone was scrambling for masks. I'll admit, it took me until about April to truly accept that things weren't going back to normal at the drop of a hat, but once I accepted that the pre-pandemic world was gone, it made it easier to accept what happened next. And oh boy, did stuff indeed happen next. It's still happening. As I mentioned earlier, I certainly appreciate the metaphor of heaven, the idea of imagining myself after death, and how it might help me reflect on my own life. It's certainly a very useful tool for thinking of how to orient one's thoughts and goals. Yet, I can't help but to wonder I'm doomed to forever misinterpret the author so long as I don't believe in an immortal soul. I agree with the song's message that death is nothing to fear.
Grim? Oh, thank goodness it's only you. It's okay, everyone. It's only death.
But my reasons for arriving at that conclusion are very different from Lord's reasons, which may have a very literal meaning to him. My own goal with this series is to show how atheists can experience catharsis. I'm still able to resonate with Things Go Away, despite the fact that I'm aware of how different my own beliefs are from the authors, because of the universal themes. So I'll admit that while my worldview may conflict with that of the authors, what matters is that I'm still able to derive a consistent interpretation without need for mental gymnastics. Ultimately, what I take away from Salvo's Things Go Away is a beautiful argument to make peace with death and enjoy life while you still have it. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe and hit that notification bell to keep up to date with everything I post. That took me a little bit longer than I thought it would, but now that I'm getting used to the process of making these videos, I think I have a better idea of how to make them faster and how to just kind of commit to writing. Admittedly, part of the reason why this came out so late is because I just procrastinate a lot. Also, I think I need to get a camera or something so that way I don't have to just fill the entire video with stock footage, because man, that is a lot of tedious work. But hey, live and learn. I'm still figuring out this whole video essayist thing. So for my next essay, I wanted to move away from Christian-related media and do something a lot more out there, being C.J. Kozeman's All Tomorrows, a billion-year chronicle of the myriad species and varying fortunes of mankind. I've already got it started on writing the first part of it, and I can't wait to share it with you.